What I'm going to talk about this evening is very loosely the history of portraiture and self-portraits in particular. A vast subject, so I will be veering off at all kinds of tangents at various points and skipping over large swathes of art history. So basically the thrust of the talk will be self-portraits, and particularly now we're living in what people, by common consent, is the age of the selfie. The first image, this was taken in 1839, a Philadelphia chemist, an amateur photographer named Robert Cornelius. He went out to his shed, and half an hour later, at the back of his workshop, and half an hour later he turned up with this. He took the image by removing the lens cap and then ran into frame where he sat for a minute before covering the lens up again. And on the back he wrote, "This is the first light picture ever taken." So this is definitely the first selfie in this now modern sense that's ever been taken. But what I want to say is that in the history of art, artists have always interspersed themselves into the frame, and all come between themselves, and always played games with identity and played games with and made themselves the primary subject of their work. Portraiture has been used for various has various uses throughout history, but they're always the same, and most of them are to do with selling something or somebody, or promote or self-promotion. So the title of this talk is going to be Brand Me, which is obviously most people consider themselves now as a brand when they're placing themselves on Facebook or social media, whatever. Portraiture has been used for flattery, for the exercise of power, propaganda, and shoring up and bolstering those in power, and for dazzling people with their power. It's been used as fantasy, transformation, and using theatrical aspects. It's been used as triumph over mortality, both in vanitas portraiture of the Renaissance and beyond, and also particularly in photography. Possibly the two most influential theorists of photography of all time, Susan Sontag and Roland Barthes, regarded the art of photography as a way of confronting and overcoming death. And they saw signs of melancholy and impending death in every single photograph taken. Now, the other important aspect to this is the history of the mirror. It is a story that Cleopatra had a mirror which was made of polished metal, which she used constantly to admire herself. Nothing has changed, only now we have phones to take selfies. This is the thing that separates ourselves from the animals. The Roman Stoic philosopher Seneca answered the question, what was the intention of nature in creating real objects and providing reflections as well? What is the meaning of the reflectability of the material world? Above all, he says, mirrors were not made for shaving in front of, or rather, as he puts it, surely it was not in order that we may pluck out our whiskers in front of a mirror or make our faces smooth. In no respect has nature made a gift of hard work to luxury. Mirrors were invented in order that man might know himself and destined to attain many benefits from this. First, knowledge of himself, next, in certain directions, wisdom. The handsome young man to avoid infamy, and the ugly, debased man to understand what he lacks in physical appearance, he must be compensated for by virtue. The first mirrors used by people were most likely to be a pool of water where they could observe their reflection and considered it magic. The first man-made mirrors were made of polished stones such as black volcanic glass and obsidian, and some examples of this kind of mirror were found in modern-day Turkey and been dated to around 6000 BC. Long before the production of glass mirrors, the ancient Egyptians made mirrors of metal, copper, and bronze, silver, and tin, and used them to gaze at their reflections. They flattened sheets of metal and polished them until it could be used to see their reflections in. This is one of the earliest surviving examples, and it's actually a mirror that is from Pompeii, and it's actually a mirror that somebody has painted their portrait upon. And it's I think you'll agree it's a very powerful image. The first ever surviving and recorded self-portrait is possibly this, although undoubtedly there would have been portraits beforehand by people running in caves, so who were not. This is the first identifiable self-portrait, and it's a sculpture. It's a stele that was made by Beck, who was the chief royal sculptor of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten. And it shows him, we know this from the hieroglyphics surrounding the frame, that depicts him as a rather prosperous and rather formidable character, together with his wife. We also know her name, Taheret. The Egyptians were masked. That probably was also created by him, as that's a profile of Akhenaten, a surviving little profile of him. The Egyptians had a sort of mastery of portraiture, and in particular to do with sarcophaguses and death. And then the same applied through Roman and Greek culture, where we see startling realism, but they're basically types, not actual portraits of recognisable people. That's a statue of a runner from Herculaneum. Or all the portraits were of gods or of mythical beings or of qualities or of concepts. So that's the goddess Flora, so that's a portrait of the concept of fertility and of spring, or of Hypnos, the god of sleep, portrayed in a sculpture there. That's an eye from a statue. Now, possibly the first recognisable portraits of individuals are the fire mummy portraits, which were created between 550 and 250 BC and 250 AD. And they were discovered in the 17th century, again, in the Fayum area, which is in the southern Nile. They're highly realistic paintings that were used to decorate mummies and sarcophaguses. Now, these have extraordinary power, and they look really modern, and they were painted whilst the subjects were in their prime, were young people, and they were painted and they would be stored ready to be used after the subject's death, and they were often attached to their mummies or attached to their coffins and sarcophaguses. But as you can see, the use of light and shade and things like that is startlingly modern, and they really have this incredible power. And then you can tell that there's the skill of the artist in portraying anatomy and realistic depiction of the jewellery and things still speaks to us 2,000 years on. Most of them, there are a few full body shots, but most of them just depict head and shoulders. At first glance, they do appear to be fairly realistic, but recent studies have shown that basically they were using certain set types, the artists, so that they would actually use certain templates and change them slightly depending on the subject. So that if a study of several dozen of them will reveal that the same eyes are used. It was probably only a handful of family-based artists, family companies of artists, and they would use the same features and reuse them again and recycle them again and again. After moving swiftly on past about 1,000 years of history, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, portraiture was basically used for, in the Dark Ages and the early medieval era, for effigies, tombs, and memorialising the powerful, queens, princesses, bishops, etc. And although the craftsmen that created these tombs and effigies were undoubtedly hugely skilled, what is important is not the character of the people being betrayed, but their status and their power and their embodiments of virtues. Even the most unpopular monarchs, for example, would be portrayed in a very flattering light. So even the biggest bastards, rogues, and despots would maybe have a certain character flaw exemplified in their portrait by having, for example, an enlarged nose, or wart or mole, but otherwise it would still be very flattering. Now, this all changed at the dawn of the Renaissance, when with the revival of ancient learning and the establishment of universities and the decline in power of the autocratic power of the church, society started to move gradually between a theocentric to a anthropocentric universe. So that instead of God being the centre of the universe, man started to become the centre of the universe and a proper subject for study. Previously, people would only really study religion and theology and classical history, but now people began to have psychological insights into things. And it started, the first flowerings of this were, it can be seen in the work of Dante and Boccaccio in Italy, and, for example, Chaucer in Britain. With this new emphasis on the human, and people actually started to examine themselves and look at themselves in a new psychologically complex beings. And so with that, art changed, and instead of just being concentrated on depictions of the powerful and shoring up power, artists started to look at themselves and examine themselves. For example, I'll go into individual details in a minute, but also alongside the philosophical and social shifts was the technical innovation at the same time, the early 14th century, when mirrors were introduced. Glassmakers on the Venetian island of Murano invented mirrors. They figured out how to combine glass with new technological breakthrough in metallurgy, which enabled them to coat the back of a piece of glass with a medley of tin and mercury, which produced a highly reflective surface. These were the first commercially available mirrors, and they completely transformed society. They became, for the first time, people could see themselves in a non-distorted way, and they became, much like an iPhone or an iPad today, they became the must-have fashion items. They were the first luxury items that most households above a certain modest income actually splashed out on and actually bought. With the advent of generally available mirrors, their gaze was obviously thrown inwards, and people saw themselves in a completely new light. As an aside, it's really interesting to note that Johannes Gutenberg, who the inventor of the printing press in Germany, actually the printing press was his second idea. He was a bit of a sort of Alan Sugar of his day. He was a bit of a serial entrepreneur, and he had several failed businesses beforehand. And he was quite a persuasive character, but his first big business idea was to create small portable mirrors for pilgrims going on pilgrimages to the Holy Land. But this failed miserably, and so as a backup, he set up the first printing press in Europe. So mirrors had priority for him. Mirrors are also used by artists and architects in order to create perspective, a proper, realistic, linear perspective. People would use it to. It was first used by Bruno Leschi. It was the first that we have. It's the first great artist that we have knowledge of his use of mirrors. Where he used in Florence, he used mirrors to project. It drew reflections in the buildings of Florence, and then recreated them as drawings to actually work out how to create proper drawings with accurate perspective. So mirrors created a fundamental shift in the consciousness of Europeans, and people became self-obsessed. They particularly the centre of of glass making and mirror making were actually Venice and Holland, which is also where, which is interestingly where some of the first great artists, such as Dürer, who was working in Venice and Holland occasionally, this where it's notable that those places were the centre of that technology as well. The mirror didn't force the Renaissance to happen, but it allowed it to do so. Now this is possibly the first truly great self-portrait in the history of Western art, and it's of Albrecht Dürer at the age of about 24, and he's obviously it is to die for good looks and his immaculate tonsure, and he's obviously drawing on religious imagery. He's betraying himself as Christ, and he described it. The title of this is Ecce Homo, as in Behold a Man. And this was quite a dangerous thing to do in that era, because this could be considered blasphemous, comparing oneself to Christ. But the get-out clause that he used to escape any accusations of blasphemy was the title itself, Ecce Homo, which is Christ as his most humble and as somebody suffering. Although Dürer was obviously, as we can tell from all the other many self-portraits he created, a real monomaniac and far from humble himself. Caravaggio was another who used to insert himself into his canvases regularly. This is Bacchus, but it is almost certainly a self-portrait of Caravaggio himself. And more disturbingly, this portrait of David with the head of Goliath has been a subject of a lot of speculation as to the general consensus is that both David and Goliath are portraits of Caravaggio himself. David as Caravaggio as a young man, and Goliath is him as an older man, so he's basically killing himself. And it's also rather disturbing in it. This was painted immediately after he had murdered, where he in 1606 when he was accused, when he actually murdered somebody and had to escape to Malta. The angle of the sword is also quite interesting as well. So he's obviously finding himself very sexually arousing at the same time. And again, this is Giorgione, and again, this is another contemporary of Caravaggio, and again, this is Giorgione portraying himself as David. So Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, famously in the Last Judgment fresco, he includes himself twice. One as this damned soul, which is supposed to be generally considered to be a comment on his frustration and the nightmare that he went through and the stress and strain of actually creating the chapel. And also again as St. Bartholomew's flayed skin, that the face on his flayed skin is actually Michelangelo. So he was rather self-pitying at the time. Artists would also insert themselves in rather unusual and grotesque ways. That's panel by Mantegna, and that he features himself as part of a extravagant floriated pattern. And then we come on to two or three of the most famous paintings which actually featured mirrors. Obviously, this is possibly the most famous of all, Van Eyck's Arnolfini Marriage, where the art, which painted in the very early 15th century, in the first decade, where Van Eyck actually features himself as the first occasion where you can actually see in the mirror, the rear of the portrait, that Van Eyck actually it becomes part of his own work of art. He is part of the act of creation. He is there, and he's inserted himself in there. And this extraordinary technical painting is an extraordinary technical feat by Parma Giannino, the self-portrait in a convex mirror, which is obviously he is showing off. He's showing his skill here. It's a tondos. It's a round frame, and just the use of perspective and the bizarre angle, the foreshortening, the composition, and the intimacy is quite startling. It must have been completely. This was painted in 1524, so it must have been absolutely staggering at the time to witness this. The American poet John Ashby wrote quite a famous poem based on this. So I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll just read a couple of lines, which is: the right hand, bigger than the head, thrust at the viewer and swerving easily away as though to protect what it advertises. Now to one of the one of the most famous paintings and most profound and enigmatic works of art in the world, which Velázquez's Las Meninas, which has long captivated viewers with its unique combination of naturalism and mystery. 19th century critics saw this as anticipating the invention of the camera, with its effect of capturing a snapshot in a moment of time and space, but really what it is, it's not a snapshot, it's a transparent window it's a transparent window and a mirror of the world. It's a painting about the nature of painting itself. What it is there are multiple theories about what this means and what is going on in this painting. Velázquez himself is inserted in the painting, and then at the back of the room, as you can see there is what has been generally considered to be King Philip and the Queen of Spain. Are they the ones being painted? Is Velázquez painting the young princess who's in the foreground there? What is he looking at? What is on the canvas? There have been millions of words written about this, but it is extraordinary puzzle, and it's ricochets in on itself, and all the figures are isolated in their own worlds, which is quite remarkable thing, and hadn't been done before, and they're all looking at us, so we are actually part of this. The only one that isn't is the handmaid of the princess. But everybody's looking at the figure at the back. What is the figure at the back? He's in the frame there. That has been sometimes interpreted as a figure of death, although he has actually been identified as probably the keeper of the royal tapestry and maybe come to fetch the princess or fetch prince. But it's probably the first self-conscious work of modern art, and so self-conscious that 10 years after it was painted, Velázquez came back and painted the cross on which is this is one of the highest orders of the Spanish court, which he was rewarded 10 years after he painted this. So he came back to put this on as like sort of inserting a medal onto it. Another example of artistic egotism is Raphael's great, massive School of Athens, where he inserts himself here, there, as not not quite sure who that is. I think that's Archimedes there, and it's Raphael and his colleague Perugino are inserted in there as two of the great philosophers or mathematicians of ancient Athens. Another trend in the Renaissance was to insert donor portraits, where artists would insert portrayals of those people, of their patrons, and those people, and the donors, and the people who are actually paying for the portraits. So you'd actually get, in usually religious scenes, so things like the Nativity or the Epiphany or the Crucifixion, you would get painters were not averse to including it's all kinds of rogues and scoundrels and robber barons and usurers will be sitting at the feet of the Virgin Mary, as in this Mantegna painting, where Mantegna's great patron, one of the Gonzago family, is kneeling at her feet. Or this image of the Adoration of the Magi, by Botticelli, was Botticelli himself. But there are also several people who have been identified as some of his comrades and some of his sponsors, just stuck in there along with the Magi and others. Now, portraiture was also used in the mid to late Renaissance. The way that it was used to shore up power and to promote power as a propaganda tool also changed with the way that as painter skills developed. And I'm going to use a couple of examples from English history here. Obviously, this is the most famous portrait of Henry VIII by Holbein. Now, Henry VIII was a pretty big bloke, and he was a powerful and impressive figure, but not, if you see other portraits of him that were more realistic, not quite as big and imposing as this. Holbein is using everything in his power, the stance of him, the stature of him. He's terrifying and formidable. There's a more accurate portrait of him by a Flemish artist, Massis, which shows probably more of the real quality of the man. And then a century later, Anthony van Dyck's portraits of Charles I, where it's blatantly borrowing from religious iconography. Charles I, in all these portraits, it's absolutely deliberate, the comparisons with the Christ-like figure. And if you see this one, it's quite extraordinary. It's quite extraordinary portrait where the three of him, which is obviously a reference to the Holy Trinity, which is quite remarkable. So this was how, although it didn't work out quite so well in Charles I's case, this was how royalty were generally perceived, and how artists used flattery to achieve those ends. Portraiture would also became more naturalistic and softer. So examples here from Botticelli, which you can see that these are readily identifiable individuals. Titian, including this quite extraordinary portrait of Cardinal Arquinto. There are two versions of this. This one is in Philadelphia, one without the veil and one with the veil. Now, the veil has been interpreted in many ways. Because he's a cardinal, it's possibly because it's to show that he's between this world and the next world. It actually bisects him almost. He's almost right down the middle. So this side of him is unworldly. He's part of this world, but he's also his mind is on higher things as well. And the veil, which is so beautifully painted, obviously represents the other world. But also there was a far more banal and mundane explanation for this, in that he took him some time to actually be officially appointed cardinal, because of political problems at the time and infighting. And so this is actually a political statement as well as a spiritual statement, because the ring of office is just outside the veil, showing he has a right to. He's being obscured by other people's vested interests, but the episcopal ring shows that he is the legitimate cardinal. other portraits, like Cranach's extraordinary portraits of women, where they do look, well, these are recognisable. That could be from a fashion shoot today, and the remarkable naturalism of that is just extraordinary. I put this in here just to show, this is by a Dutch artist, Michiel Jans van Meerenveld, but I wanted to show, because I just think this is the most magnificent ruff that's ever been seen in a painting. Now, ruffs were used as a fashion thing to actually highlight the head, and they were because of the focus on head and personality, ruffs were developed to actually draw attention away from the body to the head, and to make it to actually, and it went to extremes many times. That's de la Tour, and another extraordinary naturalistic thing. And then, obviously, possibly the greatest, or one of the two or three greatest self-portrait artists of sort of self-portrait in history, Rembrandt, who drew over 100 self-portraits, painted over 100 self-portraits, engravings, drawings, etc. He was possibly, in terms of investigating the sort of artistic autobiography, he was truly pioneering, and nobody had ever depicted themselves with such honesty before this. What is quite an interesting side of, most people would think that Rembrandt, he was doing this just purely for himself. It was a kind of form of autobiography. But actually, there was a huge market for self-portraits, so that when Rembrandt died, his estate, his estate actually owned virtually none of them. They'd all been sold. So people actually wanted these portraits. People were interested in other people. They weren't just for his own benefit. People actually bought these and studied them. So other people were interested in examining the physiognomy of others, which is quite extraordinary, really. And then I thought I'd include a few images of how female artists depicted themselves before the 19th century, because obviously life was very difficult to make a way certainly in the Renaissance, and possibly the most famous pre-19th century woman artist, Artemisia Gentileschi. She had all kinds of problems establishing herself. She was almost certainly, by any standard, she was one of the greatest artists of the Baroque era. But a lot of her art was passed off as the work of her father, because people would not buy a painting by a woman. And this is her riposte to that. The title of this is actually a self-portrait as an allegory of painting. So she is painting herself as the complete epitome of painting itself, as an embodiment of painting itself. It's a truly skillful painting, the use of the diagonal, and it is remarkably powerful work. As a complete antithesis of this artist, Catharina van Hemerson, was a Flemish artist, and she had quite a successful career, but she painted for sort of family portraits, portraits of merchants and things, and cloth merchants in Antwerp at the time. Then later into the 18th century, artists became very prominent, particularly at the French court, and so because they were associated particularly with Louis XIV and later Louis XVI, they were able to portray themselves in these very extravagant ways. She used this. That's Louis Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, and she would use this would be like a calling card. This would show I can make you look like this. She painted most of the most famous portraits of Marie Antoinette, and that's. And she's basically showing what she can do for wealthy and powerful women. This portrait is, I included this because there's a very interesting story behind this. This is by an artist, a very late 18th century French artist called Marie Denise Villiers. It's called Young Woman Drawing. When it was first exhibited at the French Academy, it was assumed by everybody that it was a joke, that this was a joke, that the name was a pseudonym, and it had actually been painted by David, because it was considered that a woman couldn't possibly paint a work of art this skilled. And it took a long time for people to be persuaded this was actually the work of the actual artist. Moving to move off at a tangent slightly, and a common theme which we'll come to in photography as well is the Vanitas portrait, which is another one of the great themes of portraiture, which is Vanitas is a symbolic work which specifically started in. It became very, very fashionable in Northern Europe during the 15th and 16th century, particularly with things like the Black Death and the Plague. And it's basically, the word vanitas means emptiness and corresponds to the quote from the Bible in Ecclesiastes, which vanity of vanity, all is vanity. They are. It's all about the meaninglessness of earthly life and the transient nature of vanity. Basically, we're all doomed and we're all going to turn to dust all in the end. But these remarkable, there are thousands and thousands of portraits featuring death. This is a remarkable one by Jericho from the 19th century, which is a self-portrait of himself as a dying man, and the hollowness of his eyes is quite remarkable. And then up to the 20th century with Robert Mapplethorpe, just before his... he took that self-portrait about 6 months before his death from complications from HIV and AIDS, and Andy Warhol took a whole series of Polaroids featuring a skull, so this is definitely in the tradition of the Vanitas. As things developed from the Enlightenment up to the era of Romanticism, portraiture changed. This is a portrait of the very young Joshua Reynolds. You can see he's rather brash. He's looking out. He's confident. He's at the end of the 18th century. He's looking out. He's looking at us, and basically he's confident of his skills, and he knows he's going to make a living. This is another extraordinary one from a fellow contemporary of his at the Royal Academy, James Barry, which is, again, it features 3 people, but this is a real vanity portrait. He obviously considers the other 2, his 2 colleagues, his 2 fellow students are shadowy. He's the one with the power. This guy is a very interesting case study. Joseph de Creux, you may recognise that in particular, he was a French artist of the very late 18th century, and he painted this series physiognomological portraits about 2 years after the French Revolution. He was absolutely obsessed with human physiognomy and frequently used his own features as a means to observe various expressions using a camera. There are very few things precedents of this in art, and they have a second life. Particularly this one. This is all over. People use this as a Facebook meme, and because this guy using sort of quotes from rappers and hip-hop artists. It's a bit like Batman slapping somebody. This is also quite common on social media. So these are basically like an 18th century equivalent of a series of self-deprecating and quirky Facebook profile pictures. And they are quite remarkable. They're quite small, and they're on display in the blue, but they are quite remarkable things. Around the same time, there was a fashion for wealthy, particularly French and British lovers, to exchange eye portraits, like the little miniatures, love tokens, that were so clandestine that even now, with a lot of research into them and scholars using them, nobody has been able to identify most of the recipients or most of the people. They were originally made fashionable by the Prince of Wales in the late 19th century, who was having an affair with a Catholic, the English having an affair with a Catholic, which of course a scandal at the time, and they had to conduct everything in secret. So he had, in order to, as a memento that wouldn't be easily identified with, he commissioned an eye portrait to be painted by possibly Reynolds, and it was set in a brooch and given to his lover, Mrs. Fitzherbert, which he wore at all times. Some of them also would also be like memento mori, so they would be reminded, be portraits of dead lovers or dead partners or even dead children. Into the 19th century, and following the 200 years of the Enlightenment and an inexorable march of reason and progress and pragmatism and industrial revolution, there was a counter-revolution in the rise of Romanticism, which it was an emphasis on individual consciousness, on melancholy, on a loosening of the formality of Enlightenment art and all the rigid rules. And the neoclassical period, particularly the 18th century, imposed very strict rules on art and on literature. And the early years of the 19th century saw a complete reaction to that. We see it with the English Romantic poets, and then in art, and later, because this is around the time of the beginning of photography, within photography. So this is a very early self-portrait by Delacroix, where he is portraying himself as a hero from a Walter Scott novel. He's very, very brooding. He looks like it's very another Delacroix portrait where he looks like he's sort of in Poldark or something. It's one. He's very, very contemporary looking, and the use of light and shade there. He's brooding, romantic. He is definitely melancholy. And this is actually just to show you that's actually a photograph of Delacroix. This is possibly one of the most iconic depictions of a tortured artist in art. It's Courbet's self-portrait as a man in torment. He did several of these, but this is the most famous version where he could be. He's basically the uber proto-goth. And this is sort of, he is a type that's recognised by this, but the unflinching gaze of that has certainly influenced cinema in particular, and the way that people did the Gothic fiction and Gothic romance and horror film, things like that, were certainly influenced by this. And there's an earlier sketch version of that showing him in a romantic, rather dramatic landscape. Now, the birth of photography, I'm just going to have a sit for it. Now, in the early years of photography, one of the first things that the early photographers and pioneers did was actually to take photographs of themselves. So here are a few examples these are very, very early. This is from about 1830. And this was actually a professional photographer, and he would use this as a business card to show what he was capable of. This is the great French photographer Gustave Le Gray, particularly famous for his extraordinary seascapes. And again, looking like very, very close resemblance to Courbet's self-portraits. This is a series of auto-portraits by Félix Nadar, where it's called revolving auto-portrait, so he's examining himself. And this extraordinary image from 1853 by the English photographer Charles Thurston Thompson is a self-portrait. Now, it's incredibly playful and incredibly complex, and what he's done. You can see what he's done there. He's set up a mirror in the countryside. He's placed a camera. There's a long exposure, and he's walked away. So it's basically a joke, but it's playing with nature the absence of artist and the conflation of reality and art. This is one of the most remarkably realistic early English photographic portraits by Julia Margaret Cameron of the astronomer and mathematician William Herschel, and then obviously she's incredibly well known for her beautiful and still contemporary looking portraits of her friends and contemporaries, which certainly have influenced all kinds of, certainly influenced fashion photography and right up to the present day. And again using artifice, fantasy to create fantasy scenarios and otherworldliness. Photographers also started to take their cameras out onto the street and try to photograph ordinary people, such as this organ grinder photographed in France in very early 1850s. There was remarkable skill involved with a lot of people became remarkably skilled very quickly at capturing the essence of people and capturing their spirit and capturing their soul. That's Edgar Allan Poe, and this is taken in the 1840s. A remarkable portrait of a child, of a little Lord Fauntleroy type with a rather impressive hat. That's a Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist and anti-slavery campaigner. The Marquise de Castiglione, again, she was one of the first people that actually started dressing up and creating different personas for herself. So she was quite a libertine and a notorious character for a time, and she was phenomenally wealthy. She got up to all kinds of scandalous behaviour, but this is her as a hermit. Another great American social reformer and abolitionist, Sojourner Truth. Nadar portrait of Sarah Bernhardt. You see, that's very realistic, and considering that there was exposure times that photographs were still required at that time, it's remarkably composed. And one of my favourite portraits of the mid to late 19th century, which is Marshall Caillebot's portrait of his brother, the painter Gustave Caillebot, standing outside the Louvre with his favourite dog, and just everything about that. I think this is such a beautiful portrait, everything from the keys that he's holding to the gaze between him and his dog. It's like he's having a conversation with the dog, to the horses in the background. It's beautiful work of art. This is not quite such a beautiful work of art, but it shows the playfulness of it. That's actually, the person on the right is Friedrich Nietzsche. So this is Friedrich Nietzsche being tethered to a cart by Lou Salome, and the other is his friend and fellow, now almost forgotten philosopher, Paul Ray. And there's a whole Freudian, there's several volumes of Freud to be written about this photograph alone. As Kafka as a very small boy. That's the actor who this is an early use of trick photography and special effects. This actor, Richard Mansfield, is the first person to portray Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde on stage, and he was a sensation. It was dramatised shortly after Stevenson's book was published, and it was a sensation both here and on Broadway. And you can see that the photographer the transformation is captured there. And there's in a similar vein, this is a Nikolai Tesla pictured at there's this laboratory in Colorado with one of the everlasting light bulb. This as an early example of celebrity photographs. Loie Fuller, the Serpentine dancer, was one of the biggest celebrities of the era, and you can see the use of theatrical type set there to place her in. And again, there's another photograph of her which is tinted, and again, that's extraordinarily dramatic. People. In other cultures too, this is one of the possibly the earliest photograph of a genuine samurai warrior, and one of a very early paparazzi photograph. That's Verdi walking very close to La Scala, and obviously caught unawares. He's definitely not posing for that. Photographs were also started to be used. People could also recognise their value as advertising tools, so that before the advent of as a replacement for the conventional business cards, people would use photographs to advertise their trade, such as this absolutely scarifying dentist, this guy who's a towel salesman, an American towel salesman. So I don't know quite what significance. This is actually rather disturbing image is a wig maker, and this is a fortune teller and tarot card reader. Very contemporary looking, and this woman is like a human billboard. She was actually selling shoe polish, but for some reason she's on roller skates. I wanted to put these three. I only came across this series of photographs very recently. I want to put these because I think these show quite how naturalistic portraits could be even in 19th of subjects in 19th century America and in this case in London. The next three photographs all feature members of the African Choir, who were a group of young South African singers that toured Britain in the very early 1890s and were a total sensation. The Queen Victoria asked them to perform for her on multiple occasions, and they sold out the Colosseum repeatedly. And the photographs are they're anonymous photographs, and the only attribution is that they were taken by the London Stereoscopic Photography Company. And I just think they're remarkable in that they are 70, 80 years ahead of their time, and they're the first time, certainly photography in this country, achieved this kind of naturalism. And if you consider that they're taking photographs of black people and consider the colonial history, and the situation of black people in the British Empire and at the time, and these are hugely important in the narrative of black people, the history of black people in this country. I think that is just extraordinary, considering that was taken 130 years ago. And there's a reason why I've included this and the succeeding portrait. Here is a sort of typical portrait of a very respectable, distinguished Victorian gentleman, a paterfamilias, looking very proprietorial, with his wife and possibly his sister or his wife's sister and his children. And there he is on his own, sort of sitting. Another portrait of Dr. Pritchard. Now, this man was a notorious poisoner, and he poisoned his entire family, and he was the last man to be hung in Scotland. So it just shows how photography is used to deceive. Now, I'm going to show a few photographs of this. Another recent discovery of mine. I think she is quite extraordinary talent and far too little known, and is pioneering, certainly in the history of photography in this country. These are photographs by these are photographs by I've lost my page right here. By Lady Clementine Howardine, who was she was a Scottish aristocrat who married a very wealthy English aristocrat, and lived in South Kensington. Now she basically lived quite a reclusive life in a huge house in South Kensington. All her photographs, she took hundreds of photographs of her daughters, and they are some of the first real fashion photographs ever taken. She was the first person, she seemed to be, before anybody else, actually interested in how how fabric hung and how people looked in it. And that she's creating psychodramas in a rather enclosed and claustrophobic space. That could be a Sarah Moon or a Deborah Turbeville portrait, or even something like Tim Walker or Miles Aldridge. And she's too little known and needs to be better. This is what women in Victorian England. There are so many pioneering women photographers, some of whom are still not known because it was something that they were allowed to do. There was no barrier for them doing it. Obviously the best known is Julia Margaret Cameron, but there are people like this creating extraordinary work. She was a very close friend of Lewis Carroll, and Lewis Carroll bought lots of these. Lots of her photographs, which I think may be significant. I think there may be something common there. Right. Now, as a bit of a sideline, I'm thinking to the Victorian hidden mother, Vogue for Victorian hidden mother photographs. Now, the first photographs required very long exposure times. People had to sit for several minutes to keep still, and obviously it was difficult enough for adults. Adults would often be held in place they would have a prop, or you would have to sit bolt upright and be strapped into position to actually have a portrait taken. And obviously this is a real problem with a baby or very small children. So the way that people obviously wanted, people who could afford to have their portraits of their children, obviously desperately wanted portraits. So the way they didn't want to detract from the babies themselves, so they would conceal themselves, and they found all kinds of ingenious ways of doing so. Where the mothers become part of the background. There's one just here hiding, there's lurking behind it. It's sort of difficult they seem very, very macabre now, where there's kind of, where some of them almost look like they're where some of them look like they're almost like the Grim Reaper, or they're kind of covered in some kind of burqa made out of chintz or carpet or something. But it was a solution to a problem that was only solved after about the first 30, 40 years of photography. But they do. There have been 2 or 3 books published on compilations of them in the past few years, and I think they are quite extraordinary. Now, leading on from that, and considerably more macabre, are the Victorian with the tradition of post-mortem photographs. Prior to the invention of photography, people often used to it was common for people, if relatives died, they would have lockets of hair, other bits and pieces which they would carry around with them. Now, in the mid-1980s, photography was becoming increasingly popular, but it was ordinary people could not afford to have their photograph taken. It was a very expensive business until the invention of snapshots. Infant mortality was also incredibly high. There were outbreaks of regular epidemics of measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, rubella, cholera, etc. So the Victorians were they were used to living, they were used to death. Death was a fact of life, and often people they would have no other memento of their child, and they would have a photograph of their child taken after as the one memory that they had of them. And people, to us, this seems incredibly disturbing that a child's sister would be photographed with her dead sibling, or in this case with that gentleman's dead pet. Most of the time it was children, but occasionally it would be adults. There's one of a dead, so it's rather blurred. That's the only version I could find of that. funeral directors actually took advantage of this. With poor people, they realised that there was a demand for these, and when poor people were scrabbling the money together to pay for a funeral for their children, they would often include, for sort of 20 or 30 years, they would include, do you want a photograph of your child as part of the funeral package? So people that couldn't afford a photograph when the child was alive would sometimes be all they'd have. So, on some, not quite as macabre, but around the same time, the vogue for spirit photography, which endured, or ghost photography, which lasted for about 60 years, which was basically developed by some fairly unscrupulous people, where photographers were experimenting with photographs and realised just by accident that they were, and by long exposures and by people moving during the taking of a photograph, that they were getting double exposures. And a couple of people realised that they could make money from this by claiming that they could take photographs of people's loved ones brought back to life. A lot of very, very distinguished and reputable people became fascinated by this and were taken in by it. You remember that people were not used to special effects. This is before the invention of cinema, and so this would have looked astonishing to most people. They wouldn't be familiar with double exposure, they wouldn't be familiar with long exposures, they wouldn't know the tricks of, unless you were a photographer yourself. So people were taken in by this, and certain people made a lot of money from it. I particularly like this one with this gentleman here with his cross. For example, that is supposedly the ghost of, that's Arthur Conan Doyle. Arthur Conan Doyle wrote extensively about this. And they also it was particularly popular in the late 19th century as part of the same social thing as the post-mortem photography, because the fact of death and the mortality rates both of infants and adults, so it was a way of people thinking they could communicate with their loved ones. They were generally debunked at the beginning of the 20th century, and there were a lot of exposures, and Houdini, when he was in this country, spent a lot of time exposing them, as did the great ghost hunter Harry Price. But the First World War and the appalling death toll there created a renewed interest and a revival in it, and it endured until 20s or 30s. There's still occasionally crops up, but I mean that's extraordinary. That's actually she's a medium, and that's her business card. So she's claiming that she can conjure spirits. Also, there are innumerable photographs where people could claim to conjure up spirits, where they would use bits of muslin and bits of cotton, and which would obviously hide in their mouths, and they would pull out, so it looked like they were producing ectoplasm, or there would be spirit trumpets flying around, sort of playing the last trump from the world beyond. I put in a couple of, because I think this is extraordinary. You can check that I put in a couple of examples of mugshots. I was going to do quite a few mugshots, but then decided I got a bit carried away and it would take forever to go. But so I put in this one because I love that. I think you can tell that this child. This is probably the first time this child has ever been photographed. This is a little boy called George Davey, who was sentenced to 3 months hard labour in Wandsworth in 1872 for stealing a rabbit because he claimed he was starving. He was 8 years old. And you can tell from his expression, I think, that he probably is not self-conscious at all. He probably hasn't been photographed, and that photograph says as much about Victorian social history as several books, I think. And then I wanted to include this one as well. This is slightly later and is from the archives of Sydney Police, and it just so that people still, just the shame, as this woman I think was picked up for soliciting or suspicion of soliciting or something, and it's just that the shame conveyed in that image is overwhelmingly powerful. Alongside general portraiture, people became interested in photographing exotic types. So, in particular in America, this was obviously to do Native Americans were the subject of, were photographed endlessly. Even these two photographs are of Geronimo, the great Apache warrior, and you can see the two different ways of portraying him. There, he's been captured here. He refused to surrender. He was eventually captured, but he's portrayed then fairly naturalistically. He's wearing kind of European type clothes, and another way of portraying him is more exotic. He looks very unhappy at being portrayed, and he's probably on display somewhere. But there were people that had sympathetic. Particularly the photographer Edward Sheriff Curtis, who took thousands of photographs of Native Americans, and some of which he was guilty of exploitation, and a lot of people criticise his methodology nowadays. It's not fashionable, but some of them achieved remarkable power and I think show complete respect for the subjects. That's not by him, but that's sort of obviously completely posed. This is actually sort of, people would be persuaded. They're probably part of a Wild West show or whatever, and they were made to. This is used for propaganda purposes to portray them as people would want them to be portrayed. People with vested interest who wanted to deprive them of lands and liberty. But again, there were beautiful shots from that era, and this I think is one of the most powerful ones I've seen of three Kiowa warriors, where they all refused to show their face. The one on the left who's sitting down, who even refused to stand up, and they refused to reveal their real names or show their faces. I think they'd been recently forced to surrender, and I think that's incredibly powerful. This is another Edward Curtis, where he also tried to document rituals and traditions of Native Americans. And this is an example of how Native Americans rapidly became wise to what was going on and the propaganda purposes to which these images were being used. This is a depiction of a ghost dance ceremony, but they didn't want it to be captured. So the man at the back is actually out of position, so it could not be captured. So they didn't maintain the integrity of what they're doing. So they were wise to what the doing. And then ethnographic photography, obviously Europeans going around Africa and Asia, taking photographs of exotic people, some of which are extraordinary records of things that are probably long lost, like sort of the Igbo tribe in Nigeria, and the Dogons. But then they also take remarkably naturalistic portraits, like this one of a pregnant woman in Senegal, which was taken around the same time as the others. As cameras became more portable, people started exploring the world and started doing ethnographic explorations and taking photographs of things and people that had never seen, and cultures that had never seen before. And there's remarkable flowering of this in the very early 19th century. This is a Mongolian princess. This is a Sikh warrior. These were all taken by European photographers travelling around looking for exotic subjects. This remarkable portrait of the woman in Oman was taken in 1917. Probably the most famous person who instigated ethnographic photographs and was the French banker Albert Kahn, who set up a foundation in 1909. He was a very, very incredibly wealthy banker, and he decided he wanted to create a visual record of mankind. He collaborated with the Lumiere brothers, who had invented the autochrome process, and he employed a whole series of a group of often incredibly talented photographers with the aim of documenting every single race on the planet and every single culture. They didn't quite succeed in their aims, but they ended up taking 183,000 photographs between 1909 and the 30s, some of which are absolutely remarkable. And certainly, these are people that have probably never been photographed before, and certainly not been seen in Europe. Some of them are guilty of they're quite most of them are quite naturalistic and not patronising. This is a woman in Vietnam, and I think they do achieve quite a lot of the naturalistic. They're naturalistic and they're not patronising really at all to people. And this is before the days of newsreels and before the days of National Geographic or anything. So this would have been very revelatory to people to see like a Mongolian tribesman. And this is taken in about 1914. And that's this guy who is the Emir of Bukhara, who was quite an extraordinary, that is quite an extraordinary photograph. The next batch of images are all images taken on Ellis Island and are of people, of newly arrived immigrants to America. And they're taken by, most of them are taken either by the great pioneering documentary photographer Lewis Hine or by Augustus Sherman, who was employed by the American government to document the people coming in. And you can see that the individual nature of each of these people is beautifully portrayed. And you can see that people were turning up in America looking for a new beginning, and they turned up in their native dress. A lot of a considerable percentage of it. It's quite extraordinary. There are thousands and thousands of pictures in this archive, and so many they are wearing. They would turn up from all over the world, and they would wear. They're fine. They would wear because they were so proud of their identities and things. I mean, there's obviously 3 Scottish boys, one looking particularly miserable at turning up. In the early 20th, photography, one of the pioneering genres of photography, which was not achieved by painting, was documentary photography and propaganda photography. Photography used for social purposes, photography had the immediacy of the images had the power to affect and change society and change law. Most notably, the first great success was in America in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, where child labour was still rife. The work of the photographer Lewis Hine was instrumental in changing American labour laws, because it was generally unknown that this was going on. He spent 15 years documenting child labour throughout, principally, I have to say, the southern states of the US, and he used to have to use all kinds of undercover methods and subterfuge to actually gain access to these factories and workshops and mines and sweatshops where the children were working. And he ended up being beaten up and slung into jail many times, and or he often had to resort to bribery to actually get his way. But when these photographs were first seen, and when they were generally published, it actually obviously caused absolute uproar, and the laws were changed permanently. This I think is one of my favourite images by him, and it's quite remarkable. It's a composite image of several dozen young boy labourers. So, and that's using a technique that was very rarely used before then, and only rarely since. And I think that's incredibly powerful. Obviously, after the Wall Street crash and during the Great Depression, photographers came into their own and helped Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans and Margaret Bourke-White and their contemporaries showed exactly the devastating effects of the Great Depression and the dust and the Great Migration. even though they took photographs of the devastation in the Dust Bowl of the actual landscape and the dilapidated buildings and things, what was the most effective and most powerful images were the pictures, the portraits of the people themselves. This woman here, is a portrait by Dorothea Lange. This was taken in the 30s. She was actually a slave. She was, I think, in her 90s at the time it was taken. Sort of Margaret White's still incredibly powerful image of a bread line in Kentucky. There's Walker Evans, and just the humanity, the humanity of the people had never been portrayed like this. Certainly, these people would not be portrayed by painters. Or if they were, they would be seen by very few people. And I'm going to talk a little bit about August Sander, because he was, I think he's one of the most important and influential photographers of the 20th century, and still influential today. He started working in Germany from about 1910 till the 40s. What he was up to, what he claimed he was doing was not taking photographs of people as much as taking pictures of what people thought they should be. So this is possibly his most famous photograph: 3 young farmers on a night out, and there's a lot to be read into that. They were dressed up to the nines. They probably own one suit. They've got their walking sticks. They're out. They're having a good time. They've had a hard week. His trick was to let people arrange themselves before the camera, and this enabled him to show the rest of us how they wanted to be seen, and what they want to be seen and what they think is their best, whether it be dressed up to the nines or whether it be doing their job properly. This woman, she looks like a sort of Weimar Republic cabaret artist, is actually a stenographer in a Munich office. But this is a rarity to show people in this way. A lot of these people lived through the First World War. Most of these are post-First World War, and obviously they were going to live through the Second World War. Some of them would have, like this man here, would have been was a First World War veteran. Many of his friends would have been perished. The world were engulfed in a cruel world, and Sander portrayed them with a unique and groundbreaking candour. That's an unemployed man in the very late 1920s. But inside, what he also is brilliant at depicting is the class structure, I think. And then the devil is in the details. We look at these and you can see where things are going. He did not, an unflinching gaze, so he did not flinch away from what was happening to Germany. These portraits of Nazi Party officials were taken 2 or 3 years before the outbreak of war. He famously said that he never made people look bad, they did that themselves.